Hello. Hello. Hey, come on. Right. So you did kind of get a brief glimpse of who I am. This guy rides to work on a bike and gets scared by my kids taking me up trees on bits of rope, which is a bit frightening. I'm head of engineering. I used to be application architect when I originally wrote this, and I was in charge of all the mobile and desktop teams at Huddle. I've now since gained the front end developers, so I really care about UX because it covers the whole of the product now. I also have too many devices, frankly. Windows phones, Android phones, tablets, an iPad mini, various slates, various laptops. It gets very awkward to justify why you're buying another gadget to the other half. So you may know the feeling. So when it comes to UX, I'm not sure there is hard and fast rules. If anyone has watched Dead Poets Society, this is a famous quote from Dead Poets Society. Well, it's a famous quote from Robert Frost, quoted in Dead Poets Society. And there's a quite a well-known UX meme showing kind of a path through a park or a field, and no one uses the path and they walk a different way. Well, in London, we have Kew Gardens Botanical Gardens, really big place. And they put up a rope to stop you walking over the grass. And there's a path just the other side of that bush. And yet everyone still walked over the rope, trampled the grass, and made a muddy path. So when you're writing software, maybe when you release the software, you might find people use it in really odd ways. Like they avoid the ropes and go over this path. So it might be just not the path that Kegon wants you to use. Maybe they should have built a path there. Or maybe, and this is typical of software, is you should improve the path that they should have used so that they actually use the bloody thing. Right, so in software, far too often we put a feature in that's hard to use and users will work around it, so you don't want to do that. However, do remember that when you're doing UX, you have different people using your software possibly. So you might have the chief of finance using it, you might have the IT administrator using it, and you might have an office admin person using exactly the same application, and they may use it in different ways. So it is okay to have multiple ways of doing things. If you actually remember in Word, when you print, there's about 4 different ways of printing. There's a print icon on the toolbar, there's Control P to print, there used to be the file menu, Alt FP, some of them brought up different dialogues, and that was all designed for different people. So I think you should be ready to put multiple paths in your software. And if you don't put multiple paths in your software, your users will end up building multiple paths through your software that you didn't even realize were possible. Who was on Twitter in the very early days? Anyone? Anyone have to retweet by typing RT in front of a message? Because there wasn't a retweet button in Twitter. So users created the concept of a retweet in Twitter until Twitter 3 years later actually implemented it as a function. So we have that at Huddle. We have a document management system. We don't have tags on documents yet. We've got it in an alpha inside the organization. So people have put tags inside comments and tags inside descriptions so they can search for things with tags. But it's not the ideal way of doing things, so we're going to implement it properly and help them transfer over to it. But people will build things in your software you couldn't believe were possible by using naming conventions or things like that are just absolute batshit crazy. And users don't think like developers. They're not meant to. Their job is not to be a developer. Their job is to do some real work. Not that developing isn't real work, of course. We all know it's real work and we toil away really hard and it's not easy and there's no way that when you've got your headphones on listening to music you're not working. Right? But users don't think like developers. They've got a real job to do and they're just using your software to get their job done. It's not their primary goal. And then the other thing that's interesting is you do get regional variations. And there's a reason that I handed out loads of these little cream eggs. And if people haven't got them, there's some left over here at the end that they can come and try. Is this funny thing called a cream egg in Britain. The company who made it, Cadbury, got took over by a US company, and they changed the chocolate from a UK version of chocolate to a US version of chocolate. And it was so horrific. This was main news on the front of newspapers. and was discussed in Parliament to discuss how they changed the chocolate and whether this was a bad idea. Have you any idea why we're not sorted out Brexit yet, if we can spend hours discussing the chocolate on a little kid sweet? Yeah. So that's the kind of regional variations you get. Now at the moment, the trade wars mean that the Chinese stock market's in trouble. So how many people realise, do you think that's the stock market shares going down or the stock market shares going up? Hands up for down. Hands up for up. There's the person who knows that red in China is a lucky colour, and those are all share prices going up. Right? Green is for a share price going down on a Chinese stock market. So if you're ever doing a picture editor at a newspaper, you should not use that to show a stock market going down in China. You have to change it round. So these are things you do have to cope with. So you have to cope with the fact that concepts are different. If you're releasing your product around the world, people do not use the same words, the same ideas. They don't even use the same colours. So we should embrace those different paths. Near Buckingham Palace, there's a light for horses crossing the road, with a button right up high for someone who's on horseback to be able to press it to make it work. So that's embracing different paths. Also, occasionally we need input from the user and we ask them questions. Anyone closed Outlook when it had an email that you hadn't finished sending? And you get this dialogue. So it's quite simple. Yes, I could save the changes and save that as a draft. No, I could throw that email away. Cancel, I can go back and have a look and see what I was doing at the time, see whether it makes sense to save or whether it makes sense to throw them away. Unfortunately, the guys who wrote Outlook, when you shut down Windows as a whole operating system and it shuts down Outlook and you had an email that you haven't finished editing, this is the dialogue that comes up. And if you hit cancel, it can't go back because Outlook's already closed. So they didn't think that you might actually shut down Windows and it would shut down Outlook and this dialogue would turn up. So the only answer you can ever the only thing you can ever do on this is hit yes, because you have no idea what it is you've left unsaved in Outlook. So this is a pointless choice. Not only is it a pointless choice, you forced your user to really think hard and they still don't have a real choice anyway. They're going to have to hit yes. So clearly, if you were going to have a solution to this, I think you would just save everything as drafts temporarily, and when you start Outlook again, you can say, hey, these are the things you didn't save properly the last time you exited, what do you want me to do with them? That's the point where you can ask the user a sensible question. So, so that's the whole description. Cancel doesn't allow you to go back, and you can't actually make a choice. Who gets money out of a cash till or an ATM? And does it have a menu with like, oh, I can choose 30, 50, 60, 100 euros, things like that? Have you ever pressed 30 and you get told there's no 10 euro notes? And it knew there were no 10 euro notes. And it didn't care. Right? The programmer decided it's too hard to make those menu items optional. We'll just tell the user to pick another value. Now, if you're using that ATM at night, having come out of a pub with a load of beer and there's a queue of people behind you, this is a really irritating thing to happen to you. And for all the people behind waiting to get some money out. So, you could say it's been solved. Modern cash machines, they actually are intelligent enough and they don't give you the option that would allow you to feel stupid. And also, you use contactless, and who uses money anyway, which is a much better solution to the entire problem, let's be honest. So that's pointless choices that you get. The other thing we have a habit of doing is, how do you work out what's important for your user? If you're going to give them information, so we don't want to give them information and force them to do pointless choices, but we don't want to also deluge them with information. I once pulled out my Nexus 9 tablet out of a drawer after 2 days, and look, there's loads of notifications in the notification bar. Absolutely tons of them. Must be something really important going on. So it wasn't anything really important. It was just some calendar reminders. Like tons of calendar reminders had turned up. This is why in later versions of Android, they desperately rework notifications to try and do grouping and selecting and trying to shut them down. So the problem here is that every application believes that every notification is vitally important to the user, and it's really important they deal with it straight away. And you know, and I know, that not everything is important as everything else. So you have to do filters. And if you over provide information, if your app is going to notify people and tell too much information on screen, the actual information a user really wants will get ignored. But they're just going to not cope with it. They're just going to scroll to the bottom, and believe me, you have to scroll all the way to the bottom to find that to clear them all. And then you lose the things that were important but you couldn't find because there was too much information. So if you're going to display lots of information in your app, you've got to be really careful. A lot of studies have shown for things like menu items, people only cope with about 7 to 10 menu items, and then it becomes confusing. So if you want to do a choice that people have, a selection of the top things, a top 10 is pretty good because people like that. As soon as you put 30 on a screen, they start struggling to read it and start struggling in their head to prioritize it because it all just becomes a wash of information. So the other thing we do as programmers is we believe everyone should understand all the programming terms we have. Or rather, we do things like not please wait while my application restarts, but restoring view state as an application kicks back into life on a phone because it's been kind of put into the background and has to come back. I don't know about you, but my dad does not understand what restoring view state means. He has no concept of that. He also, if he was hiring a bike and updated his bike hire in London, I doubt he'd understand what a SOAP encoding error was. Which, how the end user is meant to cope with that at any level, I do not know. This is actually, I was trying to say, please give me pay-as-you-go access to so that I can just put the key into the bike stand and it will take £2 off my credit card and I can then just use the bike for the day instead of having to pre-warn it that I was going to use it. It refused to accept me turning that on. It turns out the reason I had a problem was I joined very early. In my user details, I didn't have a province set because they didn't used to ask for it. But the whole of that page saved the whole of my user profile, even though I was just ticking that one box. And because I hadn't got a province, it couldn't cope with it. And that's what that error meant. So I managed to debug it, but I doubt most people would work out how to deal with that, and that would end up at the call center or help support line. And I doubt they'd like that error message either, because it doesn't really mean a lot. So I think with the too much information, it's really important that when we write our apps, we don't want to spam users with too much information, because if you have all those confirmation dialogues as well and keep asking people, anyone use an app which keeps saying yes, no to something without a little tick box saying remember this next time, and you always start hitting yes to it because you know you've got to hit yes every time to get through that dialogue. So the one point where you want to hit no, you'll still hit yes because it's your learned habit is to just press the yes button. So you only really want to stop a user when they're going to do something critical that's going to be important. And if you could intelligently handle it in any other way, carry on, put an undo, something like that, so that someone could recover from it, it's much easier for people to deal with. And be careful with that geeky terminology. We were exporting a CSV spreadsheet from our application. It's designed to go probably into Excel, probably used by an accountant. It's things like, is a person a workspace manager? Is a person an account manager? When's the last time they logged in? How many actions have they done in the last month? Things like that. The column that had, are they a workspace manager? The programmers left it as true and false to be put in the CSV file. That's a thing going into an Excel spreadsheet used by a normal business user. It should be yes or no. At worst, it should be 1 or 0, which is still horrible. But a spreadsheet should be yes or no if it's in a CSV, not true or false, because that isn't something that normal people use to describe everyday things. So how can you solve the kind of too many notifications? It's in the iPad. That's a very old version of iOS, and they had badging of apps. A very old OS that's now dead, even though I'm still using it in my hand. Windows used to put notifications on tiles, so you could glance at a phone and see how busy everything was, and you could actually filter out. There's only one SMS message in that, and I don't have to look through a whole list of notifications along the top of my on the title bar of my application. So another example, if anyone's travelled in London, the bus stops have this really big sign telling you when the next buses are going to turn up. Every now and then they go wrong, and the glorious thing about when these go wrong is they go into diagnostic mode and tell you what their IP address is. Someone complained about this, not that it showed you the IP address, but it was IPv4 and not IPv6, and what were they doing having an IPv4 network? Right. The point I have here is, it is no way to treat your customers who are waiting for a bus to show them IP addresses. You could wait for the engineer to turn up and have to plug something in to trigger that, surely. It's a very weird thing to be showing that to everyone. So, the other thing we're in danger of is showing too little information. So, I would have said, my major reason for upgrading my iPad from iOS 8 to iOS 9 was this example of too little information being given to me. And what I'm going to show you is the keyboard. So I'm just editing something with that keyboard. I'm still editing with that keyboard. Can anyone tell me which one of those causes me to get capital letters? Right? Which one? Yeah, I never learnt this. Right, in my entire life of using an iPad, I could never cope with, if it's a grey shift key, it does capitals, and if it's not, it does lowercase. Why didn't they just make the letters lowercase? They did after iOS 9. And it was this bizarre thing that they were determined that it should look like a real keyboard and have capital letters all the time and not switch. So I found that was my prime reason to upgrade to iOS 9 at the time. So that was my personal bugbear that I can whinge about forever. Because I was constantly using it in password fields, and in password fields you can't see the password, so you don't know whether you're in capitals or not. So it's absolutely the worst thing you could do, is make it confusing in my head. That stupid Outlook dialogue again is too little information, because you're asking people yes, no, cancel, and they can't make a sensible decision because you haven't told them enough. And the real key bit is, if you do give people too little information, you have to navigate further through an application, or you force people to think, or God help me, in iOS 8, I was regularly typing my password into my username field to see whether the caps lock was on or not, and which way it worked. Which meant I was typing my password in plain sight a lot, just to make sure it worked. And you don't want to make people think. Let's be honest, we write software to make people's life easier, I'd hope. That's the goal, is to replace something that's hard for them, something that may be tedious and repetitive, and we can do intelligent things in the background, and they don't have to think. They shouldn't have to. So, and to help them with that, to help them not have to think, to not have to kind of worry about what they're doing and how they're navigating through your application, maybe you want to do some consistency. So, I'm in a hotel going to a conference in Leeds. It's one of the big hotel chains in the UK. I think it was Premier Inn or Travel Lodge, one of the two. And they had a sign in the lift. So, you know, floor 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Reception and restaurant are on the ground floor. That's good. Very clear. The button on the lift is a 0, not a ground. Because the person who did the poster clearly didn't do the lift buttons. And then they had to add to the poster, by the way, for G, you need to press 0. So now they've created an issue where someone who doesn't read English has to pass English to work out what they should have pressed in the first place. Now, I would say €5 to replace a 0 with a G button when they put the lift in, or don't print a sign with G if the lift has 0. Either are a sensible solution to that. And that's just real life. And we do that in software all the time, that kind of thing. You must have had software that says, oh, you can't do that, you need to configure this bit, this setting over here. but there's no link to go to that setting. You have to navigate through 3 menus to get to the setting, to type the value in that you're not sure now that you've remembered correctly what you should do. And yet that app could have said, do you want me to change that setting for you? And that could have been enough to push through and make life easy for them. Talking of settings, I don't know how many of you were having Android phones when it was about the 2nd or 3rd real version that you could have of Android was Gingerbread. That was fun. That was a ZTE Blade. This is the first kind of €100 phone that you could get. It was around that price, so it was cheap enough to play with. To get to the settings menu, you swiped up from the bottom. I think there might have even been a hard key on the bottom. There was actually keys on the bottom of the device off the screen, and this clunky little menu came up at the bottom, and you had a cog for settings. Obviously, they improved on that. They upgraded a few versions. So by now I'm on an Acer 500. It looks much more like a modern version of Android, one has to say. And you have to swipe down from the top, and then you have to go here. You may notice that they've given up on it being a cog, and they've gone for a graphic equalizer. So, because a cog doesn't mean settings, and graphic equalizer does. I don't know how many people have seen a graphic equalizer on a device, because that's something designed by a 40-year-old who had a hi-fi with little graphic equalizer on, because no one really has them anymore. You had to click the graphic equalizer to get a screen that had another graphic equalizer that you clicked on to get to your settings menu, where the graphics equalizer icon isn't quite the same as the graphics equalizer icon you've had for the 2 previous screens. So no one's doing consistency even in the app. Clearly someone mentioned the 40-year-old no one's musicians. Some people don't understand graphic equalizers, because by the next version, on the Nexus 7, they'd changed it back to a cog, but it wasn't swiped from the middle. You can only swipe from the top right. When you swipe from the top right, there's now a settings cog that looks almost like the original settings cog, and you click it a couple of times and you get to settings. At no point, and I don't know if any of you have had an Android device, that when it's updated to a new version of Android, did it at any point tell you what they'd changed? Did you get a video? Did you get little prompts? Did you get little coach marks? Anything telling you what had happened? No. That's because when they went to the Nexus 9, and it was the next version, obviously they've moved back to swipe down the middle. Now it isn't there as a cog, but if you happen to tap in the date thing, you can get the cog up there in the top right, and then you can hit the cog to get settings. So they just kept moving it, and there's a book called Who Moved My Cheese, which is all about people changing things arbitrarily in software or business processes, and it really upsets people. When anyone moan about someone using an old IE or an old Firefox, surely they could just upgrade to the latest version of Chrome. And you have to explain to people, mainly young developers, is they're not going to just upgrade 200 desktops to the latest version of a browser. A load of those people will be really unhappy that all these things they're used to have disappeared. They have to retrain people. It's not their job to know how browsers work. So these things really matter to people, and will stop them using your software. And if they stop using your software, for us, we're a software as a service company. If people stop using our software, they stop paying the subscription fee. And if they stop paying the subscription fee, they can stop paying some developers because they haven't got enough money. So you want to keep some consistency. That hotel lift, I think you should have just put naught/G on the sign, and you would have been okay. Android settings, absolutely horrendous. What does Control F normally do in an application? Find. What does Control F do in an email in Outlook? It forwards it. Yes, you have to press F3 or F4. Apparently, if you Google it, you will find out that there was one person who was adamant that Outlook Control F should still be forward, because it always was forward. Can anyone name who you think that might be? So someone big enough in Microsoft to stop them changing it to a sensible value. Yes, Bill Gates. Apparently he insisted it stayed as forward message. The really annoying bit is I've now learnt that, and I actually use it to forward messages against all my will and power to resist. So in a similar thing, if you're in a browser on a PC, F5 refreshes the tab, the page. Control F5 is a hard refresh. You all know this if you're trying to clear caches and do web development. In Chrome OS, when you launch Chrome browser, F5 doesn't do a refresh of the tab, it goes to the settings area. So Chrome, Google should know better than that. So you've got to be careful with accelerator keys in browsers. If anyone puts them into your web apps, you've got to be careful that you're not overriding something important. If you press F in YouTube, it goes to full screen. If you press Alt F in YouTube, it goes to full screen and stops you going to the file menu that you might have tried to go to. And that kind of thing puts off users because you're changing you're overriding the behavior of the underlying app with your own web app. So be very careful putting accelerator keys that are unfamiliar. The other thing about consistency is design. How are you going to design your app, especially for mobile? Microsoft at one point was so keen on Windows 10 and Windows Mobile, Windows 8 and Metro and UWP. They released an Outlook app for Android. This is running on an Android device that used all the UWP looks. It looked like it should have been on a Windows phone. This is a mistake because this app isn't big enough to stop to use a completely different design methodology. You're meant to fit in with the ecosystem. You should have fitted in with Android. Android doesn't have those icons. It doesn't have that ... menu. That's not how Android users would want to use it. So they have to learn specifically for your software how to use it. And Mail's quite a complicated program, so I think that was an awful decision, and they eventually got rid of it anyway and bought in an Outlook client that was much better. Whereas Spotify only does one real thing. It does music, queues music up, does playlists and things, and maybe a bit of social with it, but its primary job is to do music. This is the Android Spotify app. Those are all iOS style icons above the menu bar. The selection, the on-off button is, rounded corners, all that design ethic is definitely iOS. So they've made it look like iOS on all their platforms, but it's fine because that app can own that space, and all the users are happy that every time, whether I use Spotify on the desktop or Spotify on any mobile device, it always looks the same, and I really understand how it works because it's a very simple app to use anyway. The other thing you can do is surprise your user every now and then. It's a good thing. Once my phone went off trying to think I was trying to say, "Hey Cortana," and make it do the voice activation. So someone with an iOS device then used Siri, took about 4 goes to send me a text saying you should have bought an iPhone, to which I replied using Cortana's voice reply, which is possible, and I said piss off, and it asterisked out the word piss. Right? In fact, Cortana will remove every swear word you try and put in a text message if you read it out. So if you reply to things with Cortana, it will remove swear words. It's a good drunk filter, right? It's that thing you shouldn't really have sent at that time of night, and you wish you hadn't. It's the same thing where Gmail doesn't send an email for about 30 seconds, giving you a chance to pull it back, because you hit send and go, God, no, that's not what I needed to do. Pull that back. I don't want to lose my job. Because that was straight to HR. So surprising your user is a good thing, in a good way. So things like high and low dates. Everyone must have written some kind of UI eventually where you had a start date and an end date and you were trying to find things. And users will get them the wrong way round. It's just inevitable that they'll just have a brain fade and the end date will be less than the start date. In about 25% of apps, that causes no data to come back because the programmer just put those dates straight into a database query and it will get no results back. Another about 25% will tell you you can't do that, please edit them. And the really nice ones will say, we've swapped them round. We know you got it wrong. Let's just do the search within the other way round. Now, you can actually just swap them round, execute the search, especially if it's a cheap operation that's not going to cause grief or it doesn't cost people money. That's a serious point, by the way, that costs people money. Sometimes you're getting share prices and it actually has a cost to get this data back. Or you can just swap the high and low dates round in the dialog and say, we've swapped them for you, press search again to search. Just help the user through, and that sort of thing is really cool. We did that in an app where we were searching for a user existing in a system. So Hat-Trick Ticketing gave you tickets to go to see television programs recorded. Someone might ring up and say, hey, I'm Liam Westley, my postcode is SW13 9RA. and they'd type that in, look up the user. If the user didn't exist, it auto-filled a new user form, new customer form, with the data you just searched, so that you don't have to ask the person to repeat it to them. And then they can fill in the extra details and hit save. If it finds one person, it goes straight to that person's record and shows all the tickets they've got. If it matches more than one person, it shows a list of users and you select which one you want. So that's a really nice flow for a user, because you're guessing if the user doesn't exist, we're going to add them. If it's only one, we ought to go straight to it. And if there's more than one, we show a list. And that's not the standard. Most apps don't do that. They'll do things like show one user in a list. Or they'll show no users, you hit new user, and you have to ask the user for all the information again. So that kind of thing is really nice for your customers. Of course, there are bad surprises. Dates are really problematic, right? Date pickers in apps. Who believes the first day of the month, first day of a week is a Monday? And who believes it's a Sunday? Right, because in America, it's a Sunday. I tell you now. And in Eventbrite, I went and tried to book a meetup on a Monday that was meant to be on a Tuesday, because the first day of the week in the calendar was a Sunday, and I just picked the second one without thinking about it, and it took someone to tell me I'd gone and booked it on a public holiday, and it should have been one day later. The worst case I've seen of this was a colleague who was going to Seattle for a Microsoft event, booked a flight. We were booking a flight on February, and we were flying back the same 1 week later, so it was the end of February. There's a problem with February, and the problem with February is it has 28 days in it that year, which means March has the same day on the same day of the week, right? So when he booked his return flight, he accidentally booked it in March, 1 month late. The reason we knew he'd done that only on the day he thought he was flying home was his flight was leaving 1 hour later than ours, because daylight saving time had kicked in. So that's why we knew exactly what he'd done as soon as he described it to us. I knew that because when I booked it, I did exactly the same thing, but realised within about half a day and managed to get the tickets changed. He didn't realise at all, and it cost him £1,500 to get home from Seattle and arrive 2 days late. The point is, BA could solve that, and it's not BA's fault, because I think it's probably written by Amadeus, which is a really big company that handles all the airlines' booking systems. They just need to say, are you sure you're going to go away for 5 weeks? That would be enough. You know, that's a 5-week trip, and protect them against it. And the SAS site apparently does it as well. A colleague in Oslo said that. So, I think one of the things as developers we need to do is we also need to get friendly with our designers. Who's lucky enough to have a designer in-house? Ooh. Who's lucky enough to have friends who are designers who you could talk to about stuff? Because it's really important that if you can talk to someone who does design, that you do chat to them, especially if they're inside your own company. Because in general, developers aren't the best designers of a UI or UX, because they don't think about it's not the kind of thing they're thinking about all the time. You're really keyed into functionality rather than usage. Now, the other one is designers should cope with some technical concepts. We expect a designer to understand CSS, HTML, tags, divs, how a page might be laid out, exactly how IS is going to deal with view layouts and things like that, and bindings. And in return, we need to help them understand design. All professions have a technical language. They have a technical language, and we have one. You know that professions have technical languages. Anyone enjoy reading legal contracts when they do consulting work or contract work? Do you ever read them all? Because that's in professional language for lawyers. So if we deliver that same professional language that's incomprehensible to a designer, it's not a surprise that the design comes back not quite correct. So we need to owe them a duty to understand design. If that means we read a few books that talk about design and user experience, that's a good thing. One of the reasons I have the title Don't Make Me Feel Stupid is there's a book by Alan Cooper who called The Inmates Taking Over the Asylum that discusses how developers are poor at trying to develop software for different people, talks about personas, talks about different UIs. It was written 20 years ago. Alan Cooper is infamous, or famous, depending on your view, as the guy who created Visual Basic, which you could consider his penance for creating something that created loads of forms with grey buttons on, is I wrote a book about how to design software that VB6 programmers never read. Right? So if you talk to designers, they'll talk about things like affordance, providing a guiding hand to users. So this is the thing that, if you look at the most basic thing, like a teacup, the handle is an affordance for you to be able to pick it up when it's got hot liquid in. Whereas you don't need that on a glass that's got cold liquid because it won't actually burn your hand. So that's the kind of thing, and it's a guiding hand to users. So that handle suggests that it's not a wise move to put your hand around the cup because it's going to be hot. So you shouldn't have to always say things. So I've got an example of that in the next slide. And developers are the gatekeepers. So I was told by the head of design at Huddle, a guy called Bowker, he wanted developers to question how they were designing the software, to question whether it was a wise move to go with certain options. And at Huddle we work directly with the designers. So developers work directly with design and product to try and flesh out the design as well as the technical thing. And we're expecting product to pose us the technical questions and us to pose design questions. So one of the examples of affordance is if you go up to a door into a shop or a cinema or something like that, how do you know if you're meant to push the door or pull the door? So what would you do if you wanted to, if you think you need to push it, what should there be on the door? A sign? Is there an easier way of doing it? Yes, a flat plate, piece of metal. And if you need to pull it, a handle. If you put a handle and a flat plate, so congratulations to the person who actually realised that, you don't need to put a sign on it. Everyone understands what that means. So this is a ubiquitous design that everyone can understand. Unless you're in the Museum of Architecture in Oslo, right, where they've put the word pull on one side, push on the other. You know it's on the other because you can read the pull backwards inside it. So they in the Museum of Architecture, they had a door that they had to put a sign on in English, which isn't even the language of the country you're in. So, madness. Let's be honest. So that kind of thing is just, you can solve some of these things really easily. You will know that the one case, absolutely in architecture, where no one cares about how people understand how to use things, is if you go into any bathroom, they will have found a new way of organising taps, soap and towels. So that you have no idea where the water comes from in a modern restaurant. Right? That's the one area that everyone ignores. So what are our takeaways from all this? Well, we definitely have more than one way of doing the same thing. Otherwise we wouldn't have Android and iOS, for example. We don't want to provide pointless choices to people. We want to help them as much as possible. So we want to balance that information. It's the Goldilocks thing. Not too hot, not too cold. That really nice bit of information that keeps people interested and keeps people interested. We want to be consistent so our UI makes sense. So as we rename parts of the application or redesign it, we try and carry that design through. It might take 6 months to get every part of the application up to date, but try and keep it consistent so people aren't surprised. So you want to surprise your users in a good way. Things like little coach marks or ad cues to tell people about new features so that they have a good idea of what's happening and what you've changed, unlike Android when it updates. And make friends with your designers, because the designers are there to help you make a great product. So the technical things that you make that are really cool surface to the users in a way that's really cool so everyone uses it. And on behalf of all users, please don't make users feel stupid. Right? No one likes to be insulted in their daily job by some stupid dialogue that makes them feel like they've done something wrong and they should have known about it. So thank you very much.